And this is Brass Check. We're recording this on November 13th, about 10 days or so, a little more after the election. And so many shockers. One of them is the polling gap. It appeared that it was going to be a blue wave, and Joe Biden was going to take it all, and the Democrats were going to take it all, and it turned out that it didn't really work out that way. We're not partisan here. We think both sides are preposterous. But it is interesting, isn't it? How could the polls be so wrong? Well, it's because, everybody should know this now, and it's a shame that we don't. And I had to do a lot of scholarship to find this out. I was reading a very interesting book called Desperate Deception by Thomas Mahl, M-A-H-L, and it's called British Covert Operations in the United States, 1939 to 44. And you have to know that nobody runs spycraft and manipulation and propaganda and covert operations and you name it like the Brits. And anything that the U.S. does, they learned from their British uncles. So I'm going to read about polls and polling because they didn't have polls in ancient Egypt. They didn't have polls in the Renaissance. They didn't have polls in Elizabethan England or even Victorian England. Polls are a relatively new invention. And one of the secrets of polling is they appear to be scientific. Right? Just slap that science label on anything and you can get away with anything. So let's look into the history of public opinion polls. World War II public opinion polls are widely used by historians. They are so convenient and the numbers are so crisp and credible. Occasionally, it is true, some historians will point out that poll questions were, quote, loaded, or that, quote, the right questions were not asked. Despite these flaws, historians continue to employ them, often feeling, as one wrote recently, that, quote, flawed polls are preferable to none. Few seem to even wonder about the depth or the source of the defects in polling. But here we are in 2020 and we're going to learn. The first thing to know when reading the public opinion polls commonly cited from 1939 to 1942 is that none of them was produced by disinterested seekers of truth. Okay, so now he's talking about a particular period of history, 1939 to 1942. All right, this applies to all polls. So let me say it again. None of them was produced by disinterested seekers of truth. So in the case of the polls that he's talking about in this book, the most prominently published polls were all, and I'm underlining the word all, under the influence of British intelligence, its friends, employees, and agents. At the very best, when questions of the war or international relations were considered, the major polls should be thought of as what modern critics call, quote, advocacy polls. Advocacy polls are polls that are used as a means to reach some predetermined end. Okay? So there's a whole branch of poll taking that has nothing to do with scientific analysis. It has to do with deliberately setting out to reach a predetermined end. Their purpose, says polling expert Irving Crespi, quote, is to influence policymakers by claiming that the public wants a course of action espoused by the sponsoring group to be adopted. End of quote. Unfortunately, Crespi goes on to say that advocacy polls are suspect because their, quote, intent is always apparent. The intent of these polls was not apparent. They were purported, this is now he's talking again about the specific polls taken in the late 30s and early 40s. They purported to be the scientifically, objectively gathered voice of the people. Unknown to the public, the polls of Gallup, Hadley, Cantrill, Market, Analysink, and Roper were all done under the influence of dedicated interventionists and British intelligence agents. Moreover, they were unable to bear close scrutiny or comparison with other polls even at the time. There is considerable testimony corroborating this. The British intelligence had penetrated the Gallup organization, and that the Roosevelt administration also had a man named Hadley Cantrill at Gallup. And Gallup was dissuaded for publishing polls considered harmful to the British. David Ogilvy, he's a famous ad guy, was at Gallup. And the White House did have Hadley Cantrill at Gallup. There is little reason, given the available evidence, to doubt this account. The polls were another instrument playing the correct notes from the right score in the British orchestrated attempt to move the United States towards war. By the late 1930s, the public opinion polls had become a highly visible barometer of public opinion. So there was a time when there were not public opinion polls. Then there was a time when there was public opinion polls, and then the public had to be sold on the idea that these polls were reliable, that they actually were scientifically sound, that they actually meant something. That took place, that bit of propaganda and sleight of hand was accomplished by the late 1930s. In Richard Steele's words, they, quote, became a political weapon that could be used to inform the views of the doubtful, weaken the commitment of opponents, and strengthen the commitment of supporters. And we could go on and on about this, and it gets into the details of how specific polls were used to create specific propaganda effects. So we got to look at this. Polls are not scientific. They're not reliable. They're not biased. They have been used for many, many, many decades, not as instruments of honest measurement, but instruments of influence. So one of the funniest things, and this went by really fast, and I'm glad I caught it, and I want to share it with you because it's so important. One of the outcomes of having all of these polls showing that, again, I have no dog in the fight. I think they're both equally despicable. But I'm going to talk about the Democrats right now. So Democrats were supposed to win. They were supposed to be, winning in all these different races, and it was so exciting, and the Democratic base was thrilled, and they were being encouraged to shovel money at these amazing races where Democrats had a really good chance of winning. They were close, they were ahead, they were slightly ahead, they needed more money. Literally hundreds of millions of dollars were raised by the Democrat criminal party in the last 2 months of the election using faked polls. All right. So if the real data had come out and shown that there were races where the Democrats didn't have a chance, didn't have a prayer, if you saw that, would you be willing to shovel money? Would you at a candidate that didn't have a prayer? So what the Democrats did, it's pretty clear, is went out and bought the polling results they needed and created the illusion that they were in many races all over the country where just a little bit more money would have been enough to turn the blue tide. Of course, it was nonsense. The exact opposite happened. So that's polling, and you probably are not going to hear about this anywhere else but Brass Check, and that's what we do. We take a little time to learn history and to find out what's really going on and go beneath the surface. So I hope you enjoyed that.